Just when you thought the New Orleans Saints might have figured out who they were, their identity crisis strikes again in their first shutout in nearly 20 years. We got all of that and a little bit of land yet for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that we're free and available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today's Saints Wire, Tuesdays of Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, daily fantasy made easy the way that it should be. 2 to 5 players. All you got to do is pick whether or not they're going to come in at more or less than their Prize Picks projection. You get those right, you can win up to 10 times your entry. First-time users can get a 100% instant deposit match of up to $100 by using the promo code LOCKEDON at prizepicks.com. Once again, that's promo code LOCKEDON. On today's episode, what's next in New Orleans for the New Orleans Saints after a brutal loss to the San Francisco 49ers in the Bay Area? The defense, though, stood up and stifled San Francisco's best weapon. So what happened that led to the first shutout for the New Orleans Saints in nearly 20 years. So we'll start off here by answering that very question, because a big issue for the New Orleans Saints is that once again, they lack identity, and it's week 12, which means they're not finding it, right? Like this is a team that feels like it has no idea who it is on the offensive side of the football. Understand that today when we're discussing this team, there's going to be one tone, and that one tone means that we're discussing the offense. There's going to be another tone, which is going to be the one where we're discussing the defense, because there are still some silver linings over on the defensive side. But is it all too little, too late? So when it comes to the New Orleans Saints offense, a team that we just started to think, okay, maybe they figured it out, right? 10 plus snaps for Taysom Hill at quarterback, 3-1 record on the season. They just had his season high snap count at quarterback at 17, which kept things off balance for that Los Angeles Rams defense, so much that they remained off balance when Andy Dalton was out there, which gave Andy Dalton sort of that nice cushy look that he likes very much in order for him to be able to operate over on the offensive side. Today, or Sunday, against the San Francisco 49ers, the Saints didn't go to any of that yet again. Now, I'm not sure how many snaps Taysom Hill had at quarterback. We'll see that here in a little bit. In fact, actually, I'll be able to find that for you before we wrap up this opening segment. But when it comes to where the New Orleans Saints were in this game, it just didn't feel like they knew where it was that they wanted to go or what it was that they wanted to be in this game. And that is tough. I mean, it's rough when you're still waiting to see this team be that New Orleans Saints offense that we're accustomed to seeing, because effectively, like, that's what we were sold, right? We were sold that this New Orleans Saints team was going to be a New Orleans Saints team that is still reminiscent of what they have been since 2006, and not a lot is going to change. Or let me not say it that way. Let me say since 2017, right? Because that's really the last big shift that we saw from the Saints offense. So this was a team that looks at like, being this team that can be meticulous and work their way down the field, and that will take advantage of mismatches and make sure that they get their best players in the best situations and all that. And we just haven't seen that from this New Orleans Saints team. And so this is a team that still lacks its identity. 9 snaps at quarterback. There are a couple of situations here to where, you had some review processes that were a part of that and everything as well. Penalties, stuff like that. But 9 snaps for Taysom Hill at quarterback. So again, they didn't hit that 10 snap thing. But we started to think, okay, well, maybe they figured out what the identity is here. This run first team that utilizes sort of the power run game, even against the NFL's best offenses and defenses, and finds a way to produce there. Well, the Saints were not that team. up against the San Francisco 49ers. And granted, the San Francisco 49ers were the best run defense coming into this game, but the Saints averaging just 2.9 yards per carry, coming off of a week where they averaged just barely more than that in their win against the Los Angeles Rams, where they averaged 3.7 yards per carry on the ground. The Saints just weren't able to be the team that they expected to be yet again going into this season. This has been a consistent issue for New Orleans. New Orleans has not known who they are, has not really been clear in terms of their intent around who they want to be over on the offensive side all season. And some of that has to do with play calling issues. Some of it has to do with head coaching issues. Some of it has to do with quarterback issues, things like that. I can really understand. And of course, you don't have Michael Thomas. I get all of that. Like, those things do have an impact. But for the most part, this is a team that doesn't seem willing to commit to anything. We discussed going into this game how much they needed to be stubborn, how they needed to be confident, how they needed to operate with conviction, how they needed to have pride in this game. You just really didn't see that in this one. And we saw, again, lack of discipline, false starts by your most veteran and your most reliable offensive lineman. You've got passes bouncing off the face masks of Juwan Johnson and Taysom Hill in the end zone. You have two empty red zone appearances again by this New Orleans Saints team, as led by Andy Dalton, a team that cannot finish in the red zone, cannot cap off drives in the red zone. This has been a symptom of what the New Orleans Saints offense has been with Andy Dalton at the helm. And yet we're supposed to believe that this is the best option for them in terms of an offensive decision in starting Andy Dalton over Jameis Winston. This is a team that hasn't been able to find an identity because they don't know what their roster is. It feels like they don't know who their roster is. It feels like they don't know who they are. And so over on the offensive side, in terms of who it is that they're supposed to be, the guys that you're supposed to rely on, you've got Ryan Ramczyk with a false start. You've got Alvin Kamara with 2 fumbles lost in this game. He had 7 fumbles lost in his entire career, 7 fumbles in his entire career coming into the season. He's got 4 this season alone, had 2 on Sunday. This New Orleans Saints offense has no idea who they are, what they want to be on a down-by-down basis. And you can see that because there's not any one element that they're committing to. If this was a team that would be stubborn about the run game, if this was a team that would be stubborn about deep shots down the field, if this was a team that would be meticulous in picking up sort of these small, kind of West Coast oriented play patterns like what we saw with Drew Brees in the past, then yeah, you could say, okay, well, at least they have an identity. They know who they are, and who they were wasn't enough, or who they were wasn't good enough against who the San Francisco 49ers were on defense, whatever it might be. This is a team that just consistently gets in its own way. Penalties, drop passes, bad decision-making, all of these things that just continue to plague this team. And when you have issues like giving up 50 points in the last 20 minutes of first halves this season, that's a coaching thing. But then when you're also looking at the fact that you're not scoring points in your opening drives in the first quarter, you're not getting on the board, you're not able to start off early, you're not able to build any kind of momentum early or build any type of confidence early, that's also a coaching thing over on the offensive side. So where do the New Orleans Saints go from here, particularly in dealing with stuff over on the offensive side? We'll break all of that down coming up next, but we should look at what the Saints wasted in this game. And one of the things that the Saints wasted in this game was how well the defense stood up against some of San Francisco's absolute best players, which are some of the best players in the NFL over on the offensive side. The defense did its job. The offense couldn't do theirs. That's why the New Orleans Saints lost on Sunday. We'll break that down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by Audible. Our friends over at Audible now have a whole new slate of upcoming new football podcasts that you're sure to love. Find Block Forever now wherever you get your podcast. Block Forever is a brand new podcast from former NFL All-Pro Ryan Khalil over at Odyssey. Khalil ends up taking you into the conversation around football and taking it up to the next level. Gives you football fans all the insight that you need to look into the game through the eyes of some of the greatest players and personalities of all time. You're going to hear from Christian McCaffrey to talk about like his love-hate relationship with fantasy football. Juju Smith-Schuster talks about his honest opinions of other players and positions in the league, playing through pain, being a leader, and even how to deal with combative teammates, which might be of value to you if you've got some value, some combative coworkers and all that. Simply nothing here is out of bounds. So catch the Block Forever series, available wherever you get your podcasts, available everywhere now. Audible, get in the game. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. New Orleans Saints defense stifled San Francisco's best players, but unfortunately it was a performance that is going to be overshadowed and that was wasted by the New Orleans Saints offense. We appreciate you so much by making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, for your second listen today, make sure you go and check out that Locked On Sports Today podcast. All the news that you need from around the entire world of sports, brought to you with insight from the Locked On local experts, only the way that Locked On can provide. Find it on this app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. New Orleans Saints now sitting at 4-8 on the season. Some folks will still tell you that they have a chance within the division, but it's hard. It's hard to look at this New Orleans Saints team and have an understanding of what happened on Sunday against the San Francisco 49ers on the defensive side and how inept the New Orleans Saints were on the offensive side, and say that the Saints will win 3 or 4 more games this season. Very hard to make that argument, in my opinion. But you look at what the New Orleans Saints did. Let's look at what they did against the San Francisco 49ers offense. They only allowed a 38% conversion percentage on third down. They forced a turnover on downs and a red zone possession. Fantastic defense by Marcus Davenport, being able to kind of shift past that outside block and then be able to get there to help him and Shy Tuttle secure the sack on Jimmy Garoppolo. They also had another red zone possession, the San Francisco 49ers, that came up empty or at least without a touchdown. The Saints had the San Francisco 49ers in 3 different goal-to-go situations, allowed them to convert only one of those, allowed only 1 touchdown by the San Francisco 49ers offense, which included weapons like Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey, Elijah Mitchell, and others. And the Saints kept those folks at bay. Now, Chris Harris got beat bad by Juwan Jennings, to the point to where he even took his frustration on him, or took his frustration out on him out of bounds, which led to the Juwan Jennings touchdown in the back of the end zone, where Tyrann Mathieu actually deflected it up into the air, and then Jennings came down with the catch. But outside of that, you forced a couple of field goals. You held this San Francisco 49ers offense to just 4.7 yards per play in this game, and also held their run game to only 3.3 yards per carry, keeping Christian McCaffrey at 2.9 yards per carry on his own with a long of only 9 yards. Now, you did give up 2 big plays. Brandon Ayuk had a 27-yard catch and run. Deebo Samuel had a 20-yard catch and run. But outside of that, this New Orleans Saints defense did an excellent job. 1 sack only on this one, but also had 6 additional hits on the quarterback, several passes defensed by Paulson Adebo. Kaden Elliss had another great game, led the team in tackling for what I believe is a 3rd week straight, 14 combined tackles in this game. This was a New Orleans Saints defense that played inspired and that played well, and they held the San Francisco 49ers team to just 13 points. You can't be mad at this team for doing that, especially looking at the San Francisco 49ers, who scored 38, 22, 31, and 23 over the course of their past 4 weeks. And the Saints held them to 13, their lowest total of the season since week 3 at the Denver Broncos, in a loss in which the San Francisco 49ers scored only 10 points. And what did the New Orleans Saints offense go and do? Goose egg. Scored 0 points. Came up empty in red zone possessions. 2 fumbles that led to turnovers. The only thing the New Orleans Saints defense didn't do, that they have just not done at all so far this season, is create turnovers. And one of the things that we discussed, so the 3 things that we discussed last week before this 49ers game, was that the Saints needed to get pressure on Jimmy Garoppolo. I feel like they did that okay. They didn't do that extremely well. They didn't match their season high 25 pressures like they got against Matt Stafford and the Los Angeles Rams last week. But it felt like they got considerable pressure on Jimmy Garoppolo, and they continued to hit him as well and let them know that they were there. Forced to earn turnovers was another big one. Did not do that. And then control the clock. They also did not do that, although they didn't lose they didn't lose time of possession the way that they had lost it since, the Steelers game and the Baltimore Ravens game, where they had given up over 15 minutes of time of possession to the other team. I believe they lost time of possession today by just about 9 minutes or so. I'll do the quick math. Yeah, about 9 minutes. And so, I thought the Saints defense played extremely well in this one. The only thing was that there was one moment to where they got in their way, and they could have had the turnover. Alontae Taylor in the first drive of the second half by the San Francisco 49ers, trying to kind of stop the bleeding there. The Saints get an interception. Alontae Taylor gets his first career interception, brings it back for 40 plus yards down to within the 10, and that gets called back because of an illegal hands to the face penalty, again by Chris Harris Jr., who really struggled during this game, and honestly really kind of has struggled throughout the entire season, if we're being honest, right? Like, he has not been the most solid tackler, although he's made some nice plays, and then he's also had some issues in coverage. And so he's kind of been hit or miss and everything. He's made some nice plays, but he's been somebody that's been mostly inconsistent. And then now you end up taking away from one of the Saints' shining stars in Alontae Taylor, who the Saints did not start on the outside today, by the way, or on Sunday. They started Bradley Roby opposite Paulson Adebo, and then had Chris Harris starting in the slot. Seemed to make more sense to me that you would have Paulson Adebo and Alontae Taylor starting on the outside, and then Bradley Roby starting in the slot. And granted, the Saints rotated Roby and Alontae Taylor, but why? Why go through that? Why do that and take guys on and off the field? Just start the guys that are your most talented players and that are going to bring a little bit of juice. I thought Paulson Adebo brought juice. He had a couple of different pass breakups. I counted 3 in the game. There was one that was thrown behind a receiver that he got his hand on that may even count as 4 by the time that the Pro Football Focus numbers come out. But it was such an interesting decision to me to see the Saints actually decide that they were going to start Bradley Roby on the outside in place of Alontae Taylor, which didn't make any sense to me. So we'll get media availability with Dennis Allen on Monday and discuss a little bit more about that, but really interesting decision. But the Saints defense, I thought it shouldn't go without being celebrated that they did a fantastic job against one of the most loaded rosters in terms of offensive talent in the NFL. Didn't allow for the big catch and runs or anything like that. They got a couple, but not the big catch and runs, 50, 60 yards, all that stuff. I thought the Saints did an excellent job over on the defensive side, but unfortunately the offense, as we discussed earlier, doesn't have an identity and completely kind of stepped on its own foot there and stepped in its own you-know-what. So not a great situation for the New Orleans Saints offense, but a phenomenal game by the New Orleans Saints defense that should be celebrated and not forgotten. But it'll quickly be overshadowed because the Saints were shut out for the first time since 2002, and I completely understand that. Coming up next, though, what's next for the New Orleans Saints? Big questions to ask on the coaching staff that I think could be asked sooner rather than later. We'll break down what that question is and how the New Orleans Saints could go about it as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. If you took Andy Dalton less than his Prize Picks projection of passing yards of 215.5, congratulations, you nailed it. If you took Chris Olave over 60.5 receiving yards, you nailed it. And if you took Jimmy Garoppolo under 1.5 or less than 1.5 passing touchdowns, then bam, you nailed it. And maybe you put in 2 more than that because you can pick 2 to 5 players. And that's all you got to do. Choose more or less than your Prize Picks projection. Get those right. You can win up to 10 times your entry. And first-time users can get a 100% instant deposit match of up to $100 by going to prizepicks.com or downloading the Prize Picks app using the promo code LOCKED on. With that, you can deposit $100. They'll give you $100. Deposit $50. They'll give you $50. That easy, that simple. You can get all of that today by heading over to prizepicks.com and using the promo code LOCKED ON to get that 100% instant deposit match of up to $100. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a simple look at what's next for New Orleans. And I think that there's a big question that has to be asked over on the coaching staff, and it's actually not about Dennis Allen. I'm gonna say it again. I know I've said it a bunch of times and everything like that. That like you're not gonna move on from a first-year head coach in the middle of his first year. However, The offseason will be worth watching. But if you wanted to take a look at something that the New Orleans Saints could potentially do now, is they could challenge themselves at offensive play caller a little bit and look at Pete Carmichael and say, okay, is this working? Now, the fact of the matter is that the Saints don't really have another offensive play caller to fall back on. The only one you really have that you could fall back on would be Ronald Curry, who I think should be in consideration for offensive coordinator and play caller for next year. But the issue is that he hasn't called plays before, so shifting to him in the middle of the season might not really yield the results that you want. But if you wanted to get an early look at him, and this is where the conversation between, do you like play spoiler? Do you keep competing until you're officially mathematically eliminated? Or do you kind of punt on the season and start looking at the evaluation process? You could just start looking at the evaluation process for your young players. Trevor Penning, I wish that we were talking about, him and his reps and what he got, but unfortunately that offense performed so poorly that that has to be the headline here. But then you also, could be looking at like Alontae Taylor and Rashid Shaheed, who also had a pretty nice game. And you could be looking at, some of the other guys, the younger guys in the coaching staff. Like what more can you ask of Michael Hodges, who's done a phenomenal job with the linebackers? What more could you ask from Ronald Curry, who has now prepped and gotten 6 different quarterbacks ready to start for this New Orleans Saints team, who at this point has to know the playbook back and forward and probably could go out there and call plays for you? That Pete Carmichael told me earlier this season is a guy that's ready to call plays. Do the Saints want to maybe get an early look at him? That's the big question right now for me when it comes to the New Orleans Saints is, are you going to remain content with what you've seen, an offense that lacks leadership and an offense that lacks identity, or do you try something different here and shake things up here late? Again, you're not going to do it for the simple sake of saying, oh, well, the playoffs are still within reach and we still want to make the playoffs, and so this person's going to get us there. That's probably not the decision, probably not the reason that you make that decision. More than likely, you make that decision because you want to get a look at Ronald Curry and see what else he can do, right? Other than that, that's really the only other play caller that you kind of have in the building that you could look at. You could go to Doug Marrone. Actually, that's one way that you could go. You could go to Doug Marrone, who's been an offensive coordinator in the NFL. He's been a head coach in the NFL, so you could go that route as well. Especially if you actually want to be a team that is devoted to its run game, then go with the offensive line coach. He'll probably push you to the run game a little bit. So you got two options, honestly, on staff in that case. But outside of that, you really have a lot going on. So if the big question is, how do you really shake things up over on the offense? Well, then you start to look at who's calling your plays and whether or not that's going the direction that you want it to go. And if there's an opportunity to pivot somewhere else on the coaching staff. And there are a couple of options, as we just discussed. If you don't go that route, then you're really just kind of saying, okay, well, don't want to disrupt anything, or as Dennis Allen put it the other day, you don't want to upset the apple cart. And I understand the argument for that, but then maybe you start looking at player personnel. Like, shouldn't Jameis get a shot? I mean, at this point, we've seen Andy Dalton struggle anytime that things aren't going perfectly on the offensive side. He's not somebody that elevates the pieces around him. He's someone that needs to be elevated by the pieces around him. But it's tough when the pieces around you are mostly young guys: Rashid Shaheed, Chris Olave, Juwan Johnson, Taysom Hill, who's not a young guy, but he's young to his position. Adam Troutman's still a young guy. Expecting these players to elevate their signal caller is kind of unfair. If you had Jarvis Landry and you had Michael Thomas out there, who is like the great equalizer for any quarterback that goes out there, then sure, but you don't have him. So do you instead go to somebody that can at least take the top off and give you some high level play that, is going to give you a little bit of risk, a little bit of reward, and he might have a lower floor, but he certainly has a higher ceiling, right? So, and at this point, does he have a lower floor than Andy Dalton? Because Andy Dalton just led an offense that just got shut out for the first time in 332 games. So, and to be fair, one of those passes went off of Juwan Johnson's face mask. One of those passes went off of Taysom Hill's face mask. Another one was well placed to Alvin Kamara, who fumbled the ball at the goal line. So I understand that it's not all bad when it comes to Andy Dalton. And I tried to give Andy Dalton his flowers a bit last week as well, but I also understood the condition that he was operating under last week. And so I look at it and I say, okay, well, maybe that's another place where you can at least like question and try something different. But I guess it just depends on what it is that New Orleans Saints want to do. They want to continue to compete. Do they want to evaluate, or do they just kind of want to take this like one game at a time and then see where everything goes? Which I don't think that like taking it one game at a time is realistic for you. I think you either have to make the decision to punt and start to evaluate, or to compete. And in competing, you can still evaluate as well, especially guys like Chris Olave and Alontae Taylor, the Kaden Elliss, these guys that are young and that are going to be out there one way or another. But if you're going to go that route and you want to give yourself the best chance to win, you got to make a change somewhere. And there's a couple places where you can do it. It's particularly over on the offensive side. All right, so coming up tomorrow, Analytics Tuesday, we'll break things down further. Who created the most separation for the New Orleans Saints offense? How's the offensive line holding up as they got a little bit healthier? James Hurst back in the lineup, Andrus Peat back in the lineup. And then, of course, we'll take a look at passing numbers, pressure numbers, and coverage numbers as well. How did your favorite corners perform in this game? We're going to break all that down on our Analytics Tuesday episode tomorrow on Locked On Saints. For now, though, I appreciate you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out that Locked On Sports Today podcast. Go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with the Locked On local experts. That way you can get the take of the day, as well as all the biggest storylines around the wild world of sports. You can find that on the Odyssey app, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Appreciate you, as always, making us a part of your day, a part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.